Last year, in one of the more closely watched gubernatorial races in the country, Stacey Abrams, who was a minority leader in the Georgia legislature for Democrats, challenged Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State in Georgia. And at the end of the race, a set of circumstances occurred such that Brian Kemp had more votes than Stacey Abrams did. And the way he achieved that has become a more complicated question and has brought to the fore issues and questions of voter suppression. Given that I have family roots in Georgia and on my father's side, were I able to talk to my paternal grandparents, they would probably be shocked at the extent to which the world that we live in now is familiar to them, certainly as it relates to Black people and voting.
But I'm here tonight to tell you votes remain to be counted. There are voices that were waiting to be heard. Across our state, folks are opening up the dreams of voters in absentee ballots, and we believe our chance for a stronger Georgia is just within reach.
At a certain point, the kind of political reasoning became that you have a certain number of people who are going to vote, a certain number of people who are not going to vote, and that the most reasonable way to operate a campaign is that you focus on the people who are already going to vote. The other part of it is just kind of practical, which is that registering people takes money, and people may not want to commit money to an unproven group of people. And so when Stacey Abrams came out and said that she was going to devote most of her resources to registering voters and getting them to come out, people thought that this was, let's just say, politically naive at best as a strategy.
Because I'll tell you this, in a civilized nation, the machinery of democracy should work for everyone everywhere, not just in certain places and not just on a certain day.
She is a person who had a vision about a political future in the state that not very many people could see. And if you live in Georgia, as I did for a decade, if you live in Georgia for any period of time, you will hear about the 500,000 or so unregistered African-American voters in the state. And Stacey Abrams went out and actually created a campaign, an organization called the New Georgia Project, and they began registering unregistered African-American voters. The impact of this was that in 2018, she got about 1.2 million African-American votes in Georgia. In the 2014 gubernatorial race, the Democratic candidate got 1.1 million votes total. And so she had vastly increased the number of African Americans who were voting. She got a large, significant share of white voters in the state as well. I happened to live not terribly far from Stacey Abrams when I lived in Georgia, and we kind of knew each other passingly. And when I got word that she was thinking about running for governor, I gave her a call and talked to her to get an idea about whether or not I would write a piece on the campaign. And when she told me her strategy was to register all of these hundreds of thousands of people and get them to come out and vote, I was quiet for a minute on the other end of the line. And later I said, you could probably hear my eyebrow raise when you said that. And she said, it's more like I could hear your eyes rolling.
Long before the polls opened at 7 a.m., it was clear something unusual is going on in the American South. It is a given in U.S. elections that turnout among African Americans is low. Not this time.
This race had themes that are significant for 2020. For one, Georgia has been dealing with the question of its changing demographics. African Americans are about a quarter of the electorate there now. There's a growing Latino population. There's a growing Asian population in the state. And the electorate for the Republican Party is overwhelmingly white. There's the question of people's access to the ballot. The issue of voter purges was not simply a question in Georgia. The Supreme Court took it up and actually ruled last year that it was valid that states could enact, they could purge their voter rolls with the kind of frequency that might also have the effect of preventing people from getting access to the ballot. One of the other quirks that we saw was that the Republican candidate for governor was also the Secretary of State charged with overseeing the election in which he was running. Now, this is a glaring conflict of interest. A group called Common Cause filed a lawsuit saying that they had found a vulnerability in the Georgia voter database. They went before a judge and got a demand that they address this, and this was the day before the election. There were polling places where they had machines, but they did not have power cords. There were places where they did not have enough machines and for people to vote, and you saw the lines stretching out of the polls and down the street. Some people who said that they had shown up to the polls and were not allowed to vote because they were told they were not U.S. citizens. And these were people who were, in fact, U.S. citizens, people who were born in the United States, whose citizenship had never been in question, who found that they were not allowed to vote. The results came in on Election Day, and this is a very close election. And at the end of the night, Brian Kemp has a slim lead. The Kemp campaign is demanding a concession speech. The Abrams campaign is refusing to concede until they know exactly what the tally is. There's also the question of whether or not Kemp will have a margin large enough to prevent a mandatory recount. And so the Abrams campaign is holding off to see what exactly the final tally will be. And this stretches on for about a week.
I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official who claims to represent the people in this state baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been truly appalling.
She never concedes defeat, and so she's referred to it as a non-concession speech. And for very obvious reasons. She was competing against the person who was overseeing the election. There were hundreds of thousands of voters who were purged. There were all the irregularities that people saw Election Day itself. And what the cumulative effect of that is, no one knows.
Without voter suppression, you would have probably won.
I think it is a very high likelihood, yes.
Very often when someone runs for office, if they don't win the office, we forget about that person pretty quickly. And with Abrams, one of the things that made me interested in writing about her was that the opposite happened, that the election concluded, her opponent was inaugurated, and generally speaking, in the United States, Stacey Abrams probably has a higher name recognition than the person who actually went on to become governor. It has partly been because of her association with this cause of voting rights reform. In 2008 and 2012, Black women voted at a rate that exceeded any other demographic in the country. At the same time, when you looked at the data around who holds elected office, Black women were among the least likely demographics to hold political office. And so there was a hope that Stacey Abrams, along with other people who are emerging around that same time, I think Kamala Harris would be someone that people think about as well, that they recognize them as maybe being hallmarks of this new era of political participation.
And I will do everything I can to keep you safe and help you live your best lives. Because that's what leadership requires at this moment. And it is how we breathe life back into our republic when it seems to be shallow of breath.